January 1775. Moscow. A wooden cage rolls through the snow on the back of a sled. Inside it, chained, bearded, half-starved, sits a man the crowd has been told to fear. Soldiers march beside him with bayonets fixed, not to stop him from escaping. He can barely stand. They march beside him because the government needs the people to see this, to see that the man who shook the largest empire on earth to its foundations is now nothing more than an animal in a box. 18 months earlier, this same man commanded an army of more than 25,000 men. He laid siege to a fortress city for half a year. He minted his own decrees. He built his own court, with his own counts, his own field marshals, his own crown. He told an empire of 60 million people that their empress was a liar, and for a moment, millions of them believed him over her. His name was Yemelyan Pugachev. He could not read. He could not write. And for 2 years, he was the most dangerous man in Russia. This is how a Cossack deserter convinced an empire that he was its murdered Tsar, and how it ended with his own head on a chopping block in the heart of Moscow. Act 1. The wound that never healed. To understand Pugachev, you first have to understand the lie he was standing on. In 1762, Empress Catherine the Great did not simply inherit her throne. She took it from her own husband. Tsar Peter III was overthrown in a palace coup, arrested, and within days was dead. The official cause was listed as hemorrhoidal colic. Almost nobody believed it. The empire understood quietly that its ruler had had her husband strangled to secure her crown. That single unresolved crime became a wound the empire could never quite close. Because if Peter III didn't actually die, if he had simply vanished, then somewhere out there, the real Tsar might still be alive. And every peasant, every serf, every oppressed minority crushed under Catherine's rule now had a name to attach their rage to. A ghost they could resurrect. Russia in the 1770s was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Serfs were legally property, bought and sold like livestock. The Yaik Cossacks, proud semi-independent warriors along the Yaik River, had just had their self-government violently stripped from them by the crown. Bashkir tribesmen, Tatars, Kalmyks, Chuvash and Mordvin peoples had spent generations watching the empire seize their land and crush their revolts. Russia was simultaneously fighting a brutal war against the Ottoman Empire, draining men and grain from every province. All it needed was a man willing to pick up the ghost of a dead Tsar and wear it like a coat. Act 2. The man who became a ghost. Yemelyan Pugachev was born around 1742 in a Don Cossack village called Zimoveyskaya, the very same village that, a century earlier, had produced Stepan Razin, the leader of Russia's last great peasant uprising. The local soil, it seems, had a history of growing rebels. Pugachev fought in the 7 Years' War. He fought against the Ottomans. He deserted. He was arrested. He escaped. He was arrested again and escaped again more than once, slipping out of Russian custody as if prison walls simply didn't apply to him. By the time he reached the Yaik Cossacks in 1772, he was a battle-scarred drifter with smallpox scars across his face and a body marked by old wounds. And that was the genius of the lie. Pugachev told the Yaik Cossacks that those scars on his face and body weren't smallpox and old injuries at all. They were the marks of torture, inflicted on him by Catherine's assassins when he, the true Tsar Peter III, refused to die quietly. He claimed he had escaped his own murder and wandered in hiding for a decade, waiting for the right moment to reclaim his throne and free his people. It should have been laughable. An illiterate Cossack deserter claiming to be the murdered husband of the most powerful woman in Europe. Instead, on September 17th, 1773, when Pugachev rode out and issued his first manifesto as Tsar Peter III, the Yike Cossacks didn't laugh. They knelt. Act 3. The fire spreads. Within weeks, Pugachev's army grew from a few hundred Cossacks into thousands. His manifestos promised something the empire never had: freedom from serfdom, freedom from forced conscription, freedom from crushing taxes, and the right to use the land, the forests, and the rivers without paying tribute to nobles or the crown. To a serf who had never owned anything in his life, that wasn't politics. That was salvation, dressed in the name of a murdered Tsar. The rebellion became something far stranger and more dangerous than a peasant revolt. Bashkir warriors under their own leader, Salavat Yuliyev, rode in to join him. Tatars, Kalmyks, Chuvash, and Mordvin communities, peoples who had been crushed under the empire for generations, saw Pugachev not as a Russian Tsar, but as the weapon they had been waiting for. By early 1774, his forces numbered in the tens of thousands, a patchwork rebellion of Cossacks, serfs, factory workers, and ethnic minorities who agreed on almost nothing, except that they all wanted the empire to burn. And then Pugachev did something almost theatrical in its audacity. He built himself a mirror version of Catherine's own court. He appointed his lieutenants as field marshals and counts. One of his closest commanders, Ivan Zarubin, was given the title Count Chernyshev, the exact name of one of Catherine's real generals, as if Pugachev were mocking the empire to its face. A former convict named Afanasy Sokolov, nicknamed Klopusha, became one of his key commanders. An escaped serf named Ivan Beloborodov led entire columns of recruited factory workers from the Ural industrial region, men who knew how to cast cannons, and now cast them for the rebellion instead. It was, in effect, a second Russian government, built entirely on a lie, run from horseback, and growing faster than the real empire could respond. Act 4. The Siege and the Slaughter. By October 1773, Pugachev's forces surrounded the fortress city of Orenburg. The siege lasted 6 months. 6 months of starvation inside the walls, while outside the Tsar held court, issuing decrees, executing nobles who refused to bow, and growing his legend with every week the city failed to fall. This was not a bloodless political theatre. Where Pugachev's forces took towns, the violence was swift and brutal. Landowners were dragged from their estates and hanged. Government officials who refused to recognize the true Tsar were executed in town squares, sometimes alongside their entire families. For the nobility of the Volga and Ural regions, the rebellion wasn't an abstract threat. It was a death sentence delivered by their own serfs, the moment word reached them that Peter III was coming. Catherine, in St. Petersburg, was facing something close to a nightmare. Her empire was still locked in a brutal war against the Ottomans. Her general, Alexander Bibikov, was rushed east to crush the rebellion, and died of illness in the field before he could finish the job. For a moment, Catherine genuinely considered riding out to lead the campaign herself. Her advisors talked her out of it. An empress chasing down a peasant uprising on horseback was not the image of invincibility Russia needed the world to see. In March 1774, Pugachev suffered his first true catastrophe. At the Battle of Tatishchevo Fortress, government forces shattered his army and broke the siege of Orenburg. By any normal military logic, the rebellion should have died there. It didn't. Within weeks, Pugachev had rebuilt an army almost from nothing, recruiting fresh waves of serfs and factory workers as he marched east into the Ural Mountains. The man simply would not stay dead, which, ironically, was the entire premise of his lie. The burning of Kazan. By July 1774, Pugachev's resurrected army stormed into one of the great cities of the Russian interior, Kazan. His forces tore through the city, and fire did the rest. Most of Kazan burned to the ground in a matter of hours. Only the heavily fortified Kremlin and its garrison held out against the assault, refusing to fall even as the city around it turned to ash and smoke. It was the high water mark of the rebellion, and almost immediately it became the beginning of the end. Just 3 days later, on July 15th, 1774, government forces under Colonel Ivan Mikhelson caught Pugachev's army outside Kazan and tore it apart. This time, the defeat was total. Pugachev fled west across the Volga River with the remnants of his force, while behind him, Catherine's war against the Ottomans finally ended with the signing of a peace treaty, freeing her best generals, including the already legendary Alexander Suvorov, to be sent east with one single mission: finish him. Act 6. The Betrayal. Here is the part of the story that even Pugachev never saw coming. It wasn't Catherine's armies that finally caught him. It was his own men. As the noose tightened and government forces closed in from every direction, the Cossack officers who had ridden beside Pugachev for 2 years did the math. The rebellion was dying. Suvorov was coming. And Catherine had quietly offered something more valuable than loyalty to a doomed cause: a pardon for whoever delivered the false Tsar's head or his living body. In September 1774, the men who had once knelt before him as their emperor seized Pugachev, bound him, and handed him directly to Russian authorities. The Tsar was betrayed not by a spy, not by a soldier of the empire, but by the very Cossacks who had crowned him. He was transported first to Simbirsk for interrogation, and then onward toward Moscow, locked inside that iron cage, dragged across hundreds of miles of Russian winter, put on public display in every town along the route. The empire wanted its people to watch the myth die in real time. The execution. Pugachev arrived in Moscow in November 1774. The trial that followed was never really a question of guilt, only of how and when he would die. On January 10th, 1775, a massive crowd gathered in Bolotnaya Square in the heart of Moscow to watch the sentence carried out. By the letter of Russian law for treason of this magnitude, Pugachev had been sentenced to be quartered alive, a death of prolonged, deliberate agony. But Catherine, in a detail almost nobody in that crowd knew about, had secretly ordered the executioner to break protocol. Behead him first, then carry out the quartering on his body afterward. It was, in its own twisted way, an act of mercy hidden inside a public spectacle of horror. The crowd believed they were witnessing the full brutal sentence, while the man himself was already dead before the worst of it began. His closest lieutenants did not escape the reckoning either. Some were hanged. Some were broken on the wheel. Ivan Zarubin, Count Chernyshev, the man who had mocked the empire with a borrowed title, was beheaded separately in the city of Ufa, his head left on display as a warning. Act 8. Erasing a Ghost. Catherine's response to the rebellion didn't end with the executions. It became an attempt to erase Pugachev from the map itself. The Yaik River, the heartland of the rebellion's birth, was officially renamed the Ural River. The town of Yaitsk became Uralsk. Even Pugachev's own birth village, Zimoveyskaya, was renamed, scrubbed of its association with the man who once turned it into the cradle of an uprising. Catherine wanted the next generation of Russians to grow up in a country where the geography itself no longer remembered his name. It went further and darker still. Pugachev's wife and children, people who had played no role whatsoever in the rebellion, were imprisoned for life in the remote Kexholm fortress, simply for the crime of sharing his blood. Historians estimate the rebellion and its brutal suppression left tens of thousands dead across the Volga and Ural regions, nobles slaughtered in their homes, rebels executed in mass reprisals, entire communities caught in the crossfire of a war between an empress and a ghost. It remains to this day the largest popular uprising in Russian history before the revolutions of the 20th century. And in the most quietly devastating irony of all, the rebellion forced Catherine the Great, the woman who had crushed it, to admit her empire's local government was too weak, too slow, and too disconnected to stop a peasant uprising before it nearly reached Moscow itself. Within a year, she pushed through sweeping reforms to reorganize how Russia's provinces were governed, a permanent scar left on the machinery of empire by an illiterate Cossack, who, for 2 years, made 60 million people believe a dead man had come back to take his throne. He never sat on it, but for a moment he made an empress afraid that he might.